Okay, so g'day, folks. Rob and I are joined by someone who, when I thought, who do I know who knows a lot about what's happening in Japan to try and explain Japanese life and politics, I thought, oh, I've got a brother who lives there. So we're joined by my brother. Now it says Samuel Griffiths in your name on the screen. Are we going with Samuel?
You can go with Sam. You can go with Bo.
Okay, all right. You
we,
are no.
I've always known him as Bo, so
Let's go with Bo. It'll be easier
All
for
right.
Rob's brain to compute.
Now, Bo, can you tell the audience a little bit about how long you've been in Japan and what you do there, and then launch into, if you can, what is happening with just the really big announcements in the last month on Japanese defense procurement?
Sure. Okay, so look, I've been living in Japan since 1999. I work in the recruitment sector. Nothing to do with defense recruitment, though. At this point, purely renewable energy related. But I've always been a bit of a history nerd, which, as you can tell, runs in the family. And so I keep an eye on sort of the Japanese politics and what's going on. In terms of what's been announced in the last, well, it's been a couple of months going. The biggest announcement has been that Kishida's, who's the prime minister, has basically announced that they're going to double their defense spending budget to basically bring it up close to 2% of GDP, which would bring Japan into line with what the NATO requirements are. Obviously that's an interesting announcement. Now, Japan is still constitutionally limited to being
less limited than they were, though.
Yeah, exactly. Those changes to the constitution that went through about 5 years ago did loosen things up a little bit, but fundamentally, I mean, Japan's still more or less. I think that was more really around the procurement that they got a little bit more flexibility to be able to, buy things like missiles, which are not really very defensive. I mean, there's not many defensive ways to use a missile that's not sort of air to air, right? But they're still not allowed to, build cruise missiles and that kind of stuff. So, yeah,
I bet they've got the plans for them ready to go whenever they do that.
Oh, I'm sure they do.
On that point, I mean, I remember about 10 years ago, an American friend of mine said something like, oh, well, of course, Japan can't build aircraft carriers. And I was like, no, Japan is definitely building aircraft carriers.
Well, yeah, I mean, they've got a whole series of those like flat top
helicopter destroyers.
Yeah, helicopter destroyers.
Just like Australia doesn't have an aircraft carrier either.
Mm.
Yeah, and when you've got F-35s, then those are aircraft carriers pretty quickly, right?
Mm.
So it's always been a bit of a smokescreen. But the biggest thing is obviously they can't deploy their troops anywhere, which means in terms of training, the Japanese troops are not as well trained and integrated into other other potential allies, except for, of course, the Americans, who, Japan is still full of US military, right?
Essentially occupied, you could argue.
You could.
And
especially
Australia,
Okinawa.
Yeah, and they're also doing a lot of more naval training with the Australians as well, though. So they've got their land forces going across to the US to do training over on the west coast there. So those changes to the constitution have basically freed them up a lot from the legislative restraints that they had themselves under since the 1960s, when they first started making changes to the constitution to allow them to do stuff and buy more stuff and selling. I like the article you sent through about how they're selling government bonds in order to buy more military equipment, but they won't sell government bonds to buy planes, because planes fall out of the sky, but they will sell government bonds to buy ships, because they last a lot longer.
Except when they get sunk.
Yeah. Especially when if Taiwan turns into a shooting war and China starts lighting the ships up. I mean, that's really the question, though, of Kishida-san's announced this increase in spending, right, to 2% of GDP. Great and fine. It's still unfinanced at this point, right? And so then one concept is they try and sell bonds to do that. The other one that has been floated a number of times is that they're going to introduce some kind of new tax. Now, you know, as I don't think it's a secret to say that Japan has a debt problem. The government has a debt problem. They've got the highest, debt ratio of any, major industrialized nation, and a real revenue problem moving forwards when you've already got 25% of the population being over 65.
Yeah, and a decreasing population. I mean, they peaked in 2008, 2009, and
so, yeah.
it's going down from there. So, as you say, it's an aging population that's also decreasing. So, and with fairly strict immigration laws, so they're not able to bring up more external workers in, I'm assuming.
Well, he's somewhere as an expert, but
yeah. Japanese immigration is a lot easier than you would think.
Is it? There you go. Okay.
They are weirdly. I mean, you have to have an employer in Japan. If you've got a university degree and a company that's willing to employ you, you've basically got a visa. Those visas you can get pretty much forever. It's not difficult to renew and to continue renewing. So actually that part's quite easy. The problem is getting someone to sponsor you and then finding somewhere decent to live, because whenever they try and address that, they always do it in some stupid way, right? Like they made it easier for farms to hire farm workers, but so they hired all these guys in from Cambodia and what have you. Great. They also said that they weren't allowed to bring their spouses or family with them as a condition of their visa. And you're like, wonderful. So you're going to create ghettos of Southeast Asian farmers all across the countryside of men only. That's not going to cause any problems in the local areas. Bravo, government. You've thought that through,
Yeah. Look, getting back to the defense side of things, I'm really interested, because Japan, they call it the Maritime Self-Defense Force, but it's fundamentally the Japanese Navy, and it's flying the ensigns of the old RJN these days. It's huge. It's bigger than the British Navy. It's functionally...
There's a lot more sea for them to cover.
But it's already a really big Navy. The Army is already a really big Army. We're going to talk in the rest of the podcast about how it's got more tanks than... again, equivalent peer countries. What is Japan seeing its need for this colossal defense expenditure at a time when, like you say, they've got a lot of demographic and budgetary problems?
Mate, they do have Russia right on their doorstep.
Well, Russia and China, to be fair.
I mean that the Russians have always said the islands to the north of Hokkaido there. They've got troops and tanks and forces stationed all up there saying these are ours, and that's not very far away.
I was about to say, to be fair, those islands, like, they're called disputed, but they are basically Russian. Russia has, possession is 9/10 of the law. Russia has them. Just Japan doesn't want to give up on them yet. But we've also got contested islands between Japan and Korea, and Japan and China as well. So
7,000 islands or something I read the other day.
Across the whole of Japan, yeah. So, I mean, look, it is. I agree. That's the one thing a lot of people miss, is the Japan Self-Defense Force is not small by any stretch. As a percentage of GDP, yes, they still haven't spent as much as, say, America has. But given the GDP of Japan, I mean, as much as you can talk about the demographic problems, it's still the number 3 economy in the world, right? So we're still talking about quite a significant amount of money going to it. So why increase the spending? I'm guessing at some point it is to do with trying to get a NATO membership, a NATO seat. Is
that just for the protection, or is that?
I would guess so. Yeah. I mean, which again is kind of silly, because with the number of US bases in Japan anyway, it's like, if Taiwan turns into a shooting war, Japan's going to get lit up just as badly as the United States or obviously Australia having Pine Gap and what have you as well. But Japan would go first.
Our B-52 bomber base.
Yeah, right. But Japan would probably be first, because the number of, I mean, it's where the first missiles would probably be launched from, or certainly, there'd be F-15s flying out Okinawa pretty quick.
Yeah, the pier at Yokosuka is definitely going to be on the target list.
Speaking of Okinawa,
Yokosuka. There you go. Yokosuka for sure. I mean, you got Fusa in the west of Tokyo. I mean, these army bases at Zama, probably not. Misawa is a massive US Air Force base. And then I don't even know the names of all of the ones down in Okinawa, but it's something like 1/10 of the whole landmass of Okinawa is taken by US bases. So, Japan's already tied so closely to the United States. I'm not sure why they want NATO membership, but I think they're under pressure there. What I think has been really interesting has been Japanese politicians turning up the rhetoric around Taiwan. And I've noticed that particularly in the last 6 weeks to 2 months. And what I suspect is we are going to see them try and gear up for another constitutional change. The hardliners of the LDP are seeing, Taiwan as potentially being a trigger, which could convince Japanese people to agree to change the constitution to increase the
what's the requirement for changing the constitution? Is it just the government doing it, or does it have to go to a referendum or anything like that?
I think to do this change, it would require a full referendum, right?
Is that a simple majority though, or are there other conditions on that?
I think it is just a simple majority. I'm not 100% au fait on my Japanese constitutional law because that stuff's complicated and nobody writes about it in English. So, my Japanese stretches so far, and not that far would be the answer.
Now, I mean, in the last 50 years, the Japanese have been very similar to the Germans, and obviously for very good reasons, in terms of being quite proud of being post-war, saying we learned our lessons and we don't do this stuff anymore. And in particular, Japan with its constitution, the Japanese people I've known have been quite proud of the pacifist baked in aspects of the constitution.
Yes.
How are Japanese people responding to this push?
Yeah. So what I would question what you just said there is, I 100% agree. Japanese people have been very proud of their pacifist constitution, and I think generally are very keen to maintain that. If you look at the general population, obviously, typically also very not keen to discuss anything to do with World War II, or in fact, most people just have no knowledge of it whatsoever.
But that's been a deliberate construct of the society.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is a thing that frankly, the LDP and the the monsters who made it through the
like Shinzo Abe.
Well, Shinzo Abe's grandfather Nobusuke.
My personal connection with that is my uncle was a prisoner of war over there, forced to work in one of Shinzo Abe's grandfather's coal mines as slave labor, and he fought for many years of his life. He passed away a couple of years now, but he fought for many years of his life to say, well, if we weren't slave labor, then can we get paid for being coal workers, please? And that never got taken up. So
4 years of coal miners' back pay would have been a good chunk of money.
Decent amount. I mean, that's a similar issue to what the Koreans have with. I think Japan's trying to get UNESCO World Heritage listing on Sado Island, which there's like a gold mine there. And in their colonial period, they took tons of indentured labor from Korea and made them dig gold there. And same kind of thing where they're going like, all right, so they were slaves. And Japan's going, no, they weren't slaves. Like, great, where's their pay? Let's pay them. Let's get that money, link it to inflation and pay it to their families.
Yeah, so, I hasten to add that Indigenous people in Western Australia are owed a colossal amount of back pay.
Well, most countries do have these kind of issues, but I think Japan's are particularly egregious through that period.
Yeah. But tell us more about how Japanese people.
Yeah, that early, LDP, they were trying to get people to forget what they had done, right? Kishi did not want people to know that he was, the Governor General of Manchuria or Manchukuo, as it was then. Obviously, and didn't want to highlight the fact that he had actually been sentenced to death as part of the war crimes tribunals in Tokyo, which they did effectively. The problem then is that people don't know about it, and people don't want to know about it, and they're very happy that Japan. All they know about it is that Japan does not want to be involved in another war. You'll find, typically in Japan, if you're talking, if you find somebody in Japan, a Japanese person who wants to talk about Second World War, they are almost certainly, every now and then you'll get some left-leaning communist who knows a bit about their history. Otherwise, they're a rabid, foaming at the mouth right-winger, and you're about to have a very frustrating and unpleasant, conversation with them. But the rest of the population don't know, don't care, and definitely don't want to get involved with this. So this is where, when I see this increase in spending, my thought initially, to be honest, is like, what is, Kishida-san's game here? My suspicion is it's political, and he's being willing to run this line because he thinks it'll keep Abe-san's faction of the LDP supporting him. And I also think he's aware that, this idea of raising bonds, I mean, really, like, who's going to buy them? If not that, then they're going to have to raise taxes, and that is, that's going to be a loser at the polling booth, right? Japan's already quite a high taxing,
society.
Country. Yeah. Throw an extra one on because you want to increase the military. Like, I mean, I know which way. Well, I even as a permanent resident here, I don't get to vote, but if I did, I know which way I'd be voting.
Yeah, I mean, my thought on that was that obviously increased defence spending means increased cuts of contracts and kickbacks to people in positions of power.
But it's interesting.
Someone has to pay for it.
Yeah, and what's also though interesting and is worth noting, and certainly I think for some of what you guys are talking about with the Japanese tanks and what have you, is a number of the Japanese companies who have been involved in the defense business are pulling out recently.
Oh yeah.
They're shutting down their defense business, and the reasoning is that apparently the Japanese defense forces have a fixed 5% profit margin.
Okay. So you're not allowed to charge more than make a 30% profit.
Yeah, but you can hide your costs and reroute that. I mean,
I'm sure there's ways around it, but if you look at like McDonnell Douglas is advertising, like, not advertising, but in their annual reports, they're talking about like 15, 18% profit margins on some of their constructions, right? And so, a lot of the Japanese companies just go, it's just not worth it for 5%. It's not worth doing this business. So you've seen that happening, and that obviously, like, one of the keys to America being able to spend as much money as they do is it's driving industry in the country, right?
I mean, everywhere. Yeah. Look, a question that you might have a good handle on is in Australia, we've got Australia wants to increase the military, but having huge dramas trying to get the people employed in it, and basically not enough people want to join up. What's the sort of labour market for the military in Japan like?
I think that has been an issue over the last few years as well. That Japan is really struggling with recruitment. They've increased their advertising a bit. You see them around a bit more. And the reading, I mean, I was getting on a lot on this, like, increase in spending is one of the key parts of it is they are not talking about increasing headcount of any of the defense forces. They're talking about more toys for the same number of people. And they're probably actually going to have an even harder time recruiting, because one of the other bits of news of the last month or so in Japan has been a quite serious sexual harassment case, as is often the case, is launched by one JSDF member of the Naval Self-Defense Force, and then a number of other members have come forward and confirmed or corroborated with their own stories, which puts an even worse recruitment pitch for for the JSDF. So I think that would be a major issue for them.
And are they? Do they employ women in combat roles over there?
I don't know. I don't know if it's combat roles. I'm not, because I think in every
right.
country there's sort of weird levels to what's a combat role.
Where you
right?
can go. I guess one of the other things that the Japanese self-defense forces, because of their role and the limitations of the constitution, they can't be deployed. They're not deployed very often. So while the civil engineers, like civilian engineers, might get deployed all around the world to go out and carry out waterworks and roadworks and bridge works and all that sort of civil engineering, the actual military has limited deployment. So a lot of people join the military to go see the world type thing, and you probably don't get all of that with the Japanese self-defense force.
No. And I mean, I had a friend who was a ranger in the JSDF, and he was like, "Yeah, I quit because I got bored." Like, it's like the most exciting month of the year was in March before the financial year close is end of March.
When all the money's got to be spent, and say, all right, we're going down to the range. We're going down the range, or we're going climbing Mount Yotai and skiing down the side of it with full packs and watching the Russians or something.
Oh no, they do that all the time anyway. Go skiing, but no, they'd just be like, "Oh, here, have these RPGs. We've got boxes of them," and be like, a bunch of rangers going, "We know what to do with these." Oomfa for days.
There you go.
Yeah, but it was like, it just got boring. Was never going to do anything, so quit. Went to uni, got a job.
Now, before we finish up, something that's I'm wondering about, and wondering if you can throw some light on. We talk about right wingers in Japan, and obviously there's a confluence of convenience over the years between Japanese right wingers and American interests in Japan, which doesn't have a political constituency of its own. At what point is there a parting of the ways likely with that, or are the Japanese right wingers looking at this as with a potential collapse of American power as being why they need to build up, or can you see any insight into what's motivating that?
Maybe collapse of Chinese power. Seeing what the chaos that might come out of that.
They just need to hold the Chinese off because their demographic collapse is starting too. But
yeah. I don't think. I don't think it's got anything to do with a perceived decline in US power. It should be noted that Trump and Abe were very, very close friends, and Trump had some very complimentary things to say about Abe-san, and what like effectively saying that he modeled some of what he did on what Abe-san did when he came to power in Japan. Because Abe-san, literally one of the big newspapers here is the Asahi Shimbun. It's always been quite left-leaning, and literally Abe-san cut it off at the knees. And it still exists as a newspaper, but its power has drastically weakened. There's some of the racial stuff that Abe-san did to Koreans in Japan. And it didn't really get reported, but it's been quite powerful and still has some implications, right? There was an arson attack in the Korean neighborhood in Osaka last year that's linked to that as well. So it's not just the Unification Church stuff that smears Abe-san. There's a bit more there, but I don't think it's because they see a perceived decline in the US. Yes, I mean, China's got demographic problems too, but I think they are being opportunistic about the threat of China at this point, and the fact that Xi Jinping seems to be more willing to kind of throw his weight around is making them go. Like I said, they're trying to lean on this issue of Taiwan, and Taiwan and Japan always have this very kind of oddly close relationship. Where like Taiwan is the only former colony of Japan where people seem to still like the Japanese. We'll talk fondly of that period. The
enemy of my enemy. Yeah.
Well, exactly. It's 100% related to that. So they, I think that's what's going on, and they're really just trying to lean on that. Look at big scary China. Again, like the whole rest of the world, obviously, Russia is a concern, and they're trying to push off on that as well. To be honest, I mean, I live pretty centrally in Tokyo, and if you live anywhere near either the Chinese embassy or the Russian embassy, and right between the two is the Korean embassy, who obviously also, particularly with Abe-san in power, were quite vocal in their criticisms. You get to see the right wingers out there parading in their big buses with the loudspeakers and the old rising sun flags flying on a basically weekly basis. It's pretty much every Sunday.
Mm.
Well, I literally used to live right behind the Korean embassy. So, I mean, one Sunday morning I was walking my dog and I saw this big van that was kind of designed weird, and I was like, "Oh, that's funny." And so I walked my dog up to it and was having a look inside, because the police have barricades all around it to stop them, but it was too early, so the police hadn't seen these guys when they'd driven in overnight. But having a gaijin start looking in the window, they panicked and drove off, and it was as they were driving off, I'm like, oh, they were like the hardcore right wingers, and they probably thought I knew something about. I was just being curious as to this car parked on a very narrow road.
You're obviously Antifa, yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly.
You and your dog, yeah.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I also saw one of the few times where they actually, one of the little barricades got pulled out and a bunch of guys got stopped, and for some reason a foreigner came in a car the opposite way, and I think he thought the barricade was stopping him, so he got out of his car and was like, "Hey, what's going on?" And all the Japanese guys unloaded from this van, and looked like they were going to try and kick off with this foreigner with the police in the middle. And I was like walking my dog, who was the most useless dog to have in a fight. He was a Yorkshire Terrier, towards it, and I was like, "Oh, what do I do here? Like, I can't just let this guy get a hiding from 10 nationalists." But it's me and the useless dog here. Like, what do I pick him up and use him as a missile? And
there comes a point you let the dog off the lead and find him afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Alrighty.
anyway, so those guys are around. But
thanks very much, Bo, from Totally Tanked.
Hopefully it was some kind of useful information.
I think it's very useful information for all our audience, and we will talk soon.
Alrighty, no worries. Have a good one.